Hello and welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. The United States and Iran are scheduled to sign a peace deal later this week, but disputes appear to remain over several key issues, including transit fees through the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. President Donald Trump projected confidence about the agreement as he met with world leaders in France at the G7 summit. Oil prices plunged to a 3-month low amid hopes that the U.S. Iran peace deal could end the energy supply crisis. Stock markets on Wall Street also rallied, with the Dow rising by about 1% at market close to hit a record high. President Lee Jae-myung met with Pope Leo for the first time at the Vatican and invited the Pope to Seoul for a major Catholic camp event in 2027. During their closed-door meeting, Lee is also believed to have asked the pontiff to visit North Korea. We begin this morning with the latest on the peace deal between the United States and Iran. Details of the MOU that's going to be signed on Friday have not yet been released, but both sides are already showing some splits over some details. Our Kim Bo-kyung starts us off.
U.S. President Donald Trump has said a preliminary deal to end the war with Iran has already been signed and suggested that the details of the agreement are set to be published pretty soon. Such remarks came while he was speaking on Monday alongside French President Emmanuel Macron ahead of this week's G7 meeting in France.
I'm very happy to say it's signed, the deal's all signed. This is a very powerful document, and I want it to be released, so probably pretty soon. I would say sometime after Friday.
Though Trump says the agreement has been reached, differences between the two sides are already emerging. One point both sides agree on is that once the MOU is signed, the Strait of Hormuz will reopen and the U.S. blockade will be lifted. The key question is whether commercial vessels will once again be able to pass through the Strait of Hormuz freely without paying additional fees. While Trump said there would be no transit fees, Iran's semi-official Fars news agency reported that Iran's right to collect transit fees in the Strait of Hormuz had been recognized. Another differing point, even within the U.S., is when the strait will be fully reopened. Trump said it will open on Friday.
It's signed, the deal's all signed, and the strait is already partially opened, as you know, but it's essentially ships are starting to go out now. On Friday, it'll be completely opened.
A senior U.S. official, however, reportedly said in a briefing that though maritime traffic would increase substantially, a return to normal operations within 2 weeks is unlikely. The U.S. and Iran also seem to have some differences regarding the release of frozen Iranian assets. While Iran maintains that some of its frozen assets should be released immediately upon the signing of the MOU, the U.S. has made it clear that it cannot release frozen assets simply upon the signing, as any release of frozen assets and sanctions relief must be linked to the scope and implementation of Iran's nuclear disarmament commitments. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
And global markets surged and oil prices plunged on Monday after the United States and Iran reached a deal to extend their ceasefire and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Investors cheered the prospect of easing Middle East tensions, sending major U.S. stock indexes higher for a third straight session, while crude prices fell to a 3-month low. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
Global markets rallied on Monday, and oil prices fell sharply after the United States and Iran reached an agreement to extend their ceasefire and reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a critical route for global oil shipments. Investors welcomed the development as a sign that tensions in the Middle East may be easing, raising hopes for greater stability in energy markets and lower inflation pressures worldwide. On Monday, all 3 major U.S. stock indexes advanced for a third straight session. The S&P 500 climbed 1.7%, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 468 points, or 0.9%. The Nasdaq Composite jumped 3.1%, led by strong gains in semiconductor shares. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index also continued to hit record highs, as investors poured into chip makers on optimism surrounding artificial intelligence and improving geopolitical conditions. Oil prices moved in the opposite direction. Crude futures fell more than 4% on Monday as traders responded to the ceasefire agreement and the prospect of uninterrupted oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Brent crude for August delivery settled at $83.20 a barrel, down 4.9% from the previous session. Meanwhile, West Texas Intermediate crude for July delivery closed at $80.75 a barrel, a decline of 4.8%. Both benchmarks recorded their lowest closing levels since March, when tensions involving Iran first began escalating. The market reaction followed reports that U.S. President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf had electronically signed a memorandum of understanding, formally endorsing the ceasefire. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
The reopening of the Strait of Hormuz may have been announced, but the effects of the conflict between the United States and Iran on global energy markets are far from over. Our correspondent Park Gun-woo spoke with a senior official at the International Energy Agency about the road ahead and its implications for South Korea.
The normalization of global energy markets could still take many months. That's according to Tim Gould, Chief Energy Economist at the International Energy Agency, speaking following the declaration of an end to hostilities between the U.S. and Iran.
If you just look at the sailing times from the Middle East to markets around the world, I mean, to get to Korea takes the best part of 3 or 4 weeks. So in our view, it will take many, many months to get back to somewhere close to where we were prior to the conflict.
Gould also warned that energy markets may never fully return to their pre-conflict state.
And in some ways, we may never get back to the situation that we had in February, because there is also the question of confidence in the strait, and that confidence is now quite fragile. So people will have in their mind that the strait has been closed once, perhaps it will close again.
That comes as fuel importing countries are likely to reassess their energy security strategies, following months of disruptions to global oil and gas flows. So South Korea relies heavily on energy imports. So what lessons do you think South Korea can earn from the recent crisis?
First golden rule of energy security, and that is diversification. Diversification of routes, diversification of suppliers, diversification of the energy mix, because wherever we see high levels of concentration in the energy system, that comes with some risks.
Gould said the crisis could accelerate investment in renewable and nuclear energy, while also speeding up the shift toward what he calls the age of electricity.
If you are using electricity, domestically produced electricity, that displaces then your need for oil imports. Korea is very well placed in some of those areas because it does have, a very well-developed ecosystem for example, for battery production, for all sorts of areas of technology development.
The IEA Economist also highlighted Korea's role as a key partner in future energy security discussions.
As we move on from this crisis, there will be a lot of discussions about how countries can safeguard their energy security interests in this new environment that we are in. And we are looking to Korea as a leader in some of those initiatives.
He added that the Middle East conflict could reshape how countries view energy security and energy transitions, saying the world is entering a new era of energy discussions. Park Gun-woo, Arirang News, Paris.
Korea's export prices rose for an 11th straight month in May, driven by strong global demand for memory chips and non-ferrous metals linked to growing investment in artificial intelligence. According to the Bank of Korea on Tuesday, the export price index climbed 0.3% from April to 188.58. While the monthly increase slowed, export prices were nearly 47% higher than a year earlier. Meanwhile, import prices fell 0.3% for a second consecutive month as lower international oil prices reduced the cost of imported mining products, coal, and petroleum goods. Now, for more on this, we're joined today by Professor Oh Jun-seok, Dean at the College of Economics and Business at Sookmyung Women's University. Professor Oh, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
So, global oil prices fell after the United States and Iran announced a ceasefire deal, but many energy experts say it could take months before oil and gas supplies return to normal. Why is this, and does this mean consumers will have to wait longer before actually seeing lower oil prices and costs for food and other goods?
High oil and gasoline prices are energy supply problems won't be solved overnight. It will be likely take months before energy companies can restore its operations to the level of the normalcy. Ships loaded with crude oil have been stranded in the Persian Gulf for more than 3 months, through which about 1/5 of the world's oil and gasoline supply typically traveled before the war began. The slow pace of shipping and refining crude oil and doubts about the security of traveling through the strait imply the effect won't be seen immediately. In addition, most physical oil and gas volumes are traded on long-term forward contract, which means signed months in advance. In this way, consumers must wait longer because businesses are currently selling inventory produced and stored in older, more expensive energy. As fertilizer, a byproduct of oil, has already in cost, putting pressure on farmers. Global food prices could also be helped if the supplies of fertilizer get closer to the normal level again. And jet fuel, another byproduct of oil traded in Northwest Europe, has already seen a small fall in prices. Next wave will be a monetary contraction. The Iran war has affected economies around the world as the jump in energy cost has pushed up fuel prices, leading to a pickup in inflation. This has pressure on central banks in most countries to raise interest rates with tightening monetary policy to keep inflation under control.
I see. And the U.S. dollar also weakened against major currencies after the ceasefire was announced. Could this also pave the way for the Korean won to strengthen against the dollar and potentially move below the 1,500 won level? And what risks could still keep exchange rate volatility elevated?
Yes, as you mentioned, the U.S. dollar index measuring the greenback against a basket of currencies, including the euro, yen, and pound, has shown near multi-year lows. As for Korean won, in spite of a continued increase in export and investment, sparked by a strong performance of the semiconductor and IT sectors especially, contrary to the weakening trend of the U.S. dollar, the $1 exchange rate continues to above 1,500 ranges. This might be mainly due to safe haven demand and corporate dollar holding under the high exposure to global uncertainty. The U.S. Iran framework agreement to restore passage through the Strait of Hormuz could probably cool the global panic of buying dollars as time goes. However, as I experienced when I was at practice in the period of financial crisis, at this time, most dealers fearing consecutive extreme fluctuations, then believing that dollar is the king. And so the Korean export firms are refusing to convert their dollar earnings back into one, starving at the local foreign exchange market of supply. So, accordingly, regulatory intervention and crackdown follows as usual. Bank of Korea and Financial Supervisory Board, they recently launched their joint inspection of foreign exchange banks to root out speculative trading and so-called artificial dollar holding. Despite the positive momentum of Korean economy, private sector is counting on another risk factor, which will not be changed easily. That is capital outflow. Continued trend of this kind of market, diversification by individual retail traders and national pension services create a permanent and structural demand for dollar. That is the weakest point of working against won appreciation. It could have been worse. Korea's economy will likely grow at a sharper than expected pace of 2.5% this year, thanks to strong export.
And the U.S. Federal Reserve is set to make its policy decision later this week. And with the ceasefire now in place, many analysts believe the Fed is less likely to raise rates. Why has this outlook shifted, and what implications could this have for monetary policy in other major economies?
Yes, U.S. Federal Reserve is less likely to raise rate because the ceasefire reduced the threat of energy-related stagflation. The U.S. Federal Reserve is expected to hold its benchmark interest rate steady at 3.5% to a 3.75% range. Why has the outlook shifted? Global factors such as commodity price and equity markets were the primary driver of foreign exchange movement earlier this year. More recently, domestic factors in the United States, including the interest rate differentials, have begun to play a larger role in determining currency performance. Prior to the ceasefire, surging West Texas Intermediate crude price had pushed the Fed officials to actively consider rate hikes. The reopening of the Strait of Hormuz diffused a major supply side shock. What implications could we have? Hikes are highly effective against demand-driven inflation, but raising rates into geopolitical risk will be likely to induce a severe recession as a result. When the Fed raises rates, it consequently triggers capital flight and depreciate emerging markets and the European currencies. On and on over big waves follows. Thus, in short, at this moment, a steady Fed rate will be an answer to calm down volatility and reduce downward pressure on these currencies. Global easing imported inflation concerns.
I see. All right, Professor, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your insight today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
President Lee Jae-myung, who's on a 10-day trip to Europe, has met Pope Leo XIV for the first time. He invited the Pope to Seoul for a major Catholic camp event next year and discussed regional peace with the spiritual leader. Our Yoon Jung-min is traveling with the president and reports from Rome.
The South Korean first couple was given a warm welcome at the Vatican. In their first meeting on Monday, a one-on-one that lasted for about half an hour, President Lee Jae-myung invited Pope Leo XIV to South Korea for World Youth Day Seoul 2027.
The leaders agreed to closely cooperate for the success of World Youth Day Seoul 2027. President Lee politely invited Leo XIV to visit South Korea on the occasion.
Regional peace was a key topic between the president and the spiritual leader.
The president explained to the Pope our people's desire and government's vision for peace on the Korean peninsula, and they reaffirmed the Vatican's unwavering support for peace and reconciliation on the peninsula.
Details were undisclosed, but it seems as though President Lee also might have asked the Pope to pay a visit to North Korea. When meeting Cardinal Lazaro Yuhung-sik last year, Lee said he hoped the Pope could stop by North Korea during his trip to Seoul. Meeting the press corps, the Cardinal said whether the visit actually happens or not depends on the North regime.
I think it depends on the North. It's the one that has to invite the Pope and create conditions.
A senior Blue House official said President Lee vowed to continue working to improve inter-Korean ties, while acknowledging that it may take time and patience. As Lee reportedly cited a line from the Bible, "Knock at the door and it will be opened." The Holy See stressed the importance of hope. The Korean leader presented the Pope with a sculpture representing God's embrace, referring to the prodigal son from the Gospel, and the Pope gifted the president with a message for the 59th World Day of Peace. Concluding his visit to the Vatican, President Lee will head to France to attend the G7 summit, where world leaders are set to address a host of global challenges. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News, Rome.
Meeting the Korean community in Italy, President Lee Jae-myung has promised to improve the overseas voting system as quickly as possible. He said he takes it very seriously that some overseas Koreans could not exercise their voting rights due to certain administrative issues. The president also promised a better system for Korean nationals adopted overseas when they try to find their origins or families to ensure that they stay connected to their motherland. The South Korean national football team has completed its first full squad training session since arriving in Guadalajara, Mexico. Led by head coach Hong Myung-bo, South Korea trained on Monday, 3 days ahead of its second Group A match at the 2026 FIFA World Cup against Mexico. Midfielder Bae Jun-ho and defender Kim Tae-hyun, both recovering from injuries, rejoined team training, allowing all 26 players to take part in a full session together for the first time since the squad arrived in Guadalajara. Bae had suffered an ankle injury during a friendly against Trinidad and Tobago in May, while Kim injured ligaments in his left ankle during training 2 days before Korea's victory over Czechia.
Good morning, I'm Chu Ji-hyun, and this is The World Now. Russia launched its largest drone and missile barrage of the war overnight on Monday, killing 11 people and setting fire to the roof of an 11th century monastery in Kyiv that UNESCO calls one of Eastern Orthodox Christianity's most sacred landmarks. More than 680 drones and missiles targeted Kyiv and the cities of Kharkiv and Dnipro, hours after President Zelensky and Vladimir Putin separately spoke by phone with President Trump. Ukraine's air defenses intercepted 632 aerial targets. 5 people were killed in Kyiv, including in strikes on apartment buildings and a market. The Kyiv-Perchesk Lavra, also known as the Monastery of the Caves, suffered significant damage. Zelensky called it Russia's, quote, biggest crime yet against Christian culture and urged G7 leaders meeting in France to deliver a decisive response. In the U.S., 8 crew members have been killed in a crash involving an Air Force B-52 Stratofortress bomber shortly after takeoff from Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California's Mojave Desert on Monday. The 8-engine bomber went down at 11:20 in the morning while on a test mission roughly 100 miles north of Los Angeles. Officials at the airbase said the crash was, quote, not survivable and that emergency crews had been sent to the scene to account for all personnel. Aerial footage of the crash site showed a charred area roughly the size of a football field. The incident is the first crash of the nuclear-capable B-52 aircraft since 2016. In the UK, children under 16 will be banned from accessing social media platforms, including TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, Facebook, and X from spring 2027. Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced the move on Monday in one of the most sweeping restrictions on children's internet use by any major democracy. The government said legislation would pass before Christmas, with the ban taking effect early next year. Age verification will be required for over 16s wishing to continue using the platforms. U.S. President Donald Trump hosted the first professional sporting event ever held at the White House on Sunday as part of the nation's 250th anniversary. The 7-fight UFC card on the South Lawn came hours after Trump announced a peace agreement with Iran. 4,000 guests watched the fights, including military personnel, corporate sponsors, and political allies, but tickets were not sold to the public. Underdog Justin Gaethje defeated Ilia Topuria to claim the UFC lightweight championship in the main event.
It feels like we have jumped right into the middle of summer from last week's pleasant late spring warmth. The heat has intensified since the weekend, bringing sizzling temperatures to many regions. And Seoul could see a new record this afternoon. And strong sunshine will add to the heat today. UV levels are expected to reach very high levels in most parts of Korea. So if you're heading outdoors, be sure to protect yourself from the sun with a hat, a umbrella and sunglasses. Then there is a chance of passing rain in Gyeonggi-do province and mountainous areas of Gangwon-do and Jeollado provinces with 5 to 20 millimeters in the forecast. Lastly, checking on today's highs, Seoul will be getting up to 33 degrees Celsius, Gwangju to 32 degrees, Daejeon topping out at 32 as well. Stay hydrated and take care.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.